Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The Debate for Equal Education Rights by Dirk Komarnitsky. In Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court debated the separate but equal laws that segregated schools throughout the nation. The decision succeeded in giving black children the same educational opportunities as their white counterparts. Though blacks faced resistance from the school districts at first, the changes were finally done, allowing blacks to change the future. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court decided to hear the case Sanford versus Scott. Dred Scott, a slave, had lived in Illinois and Wisconsin for an extended amount of time, both areas that had abolished slavery through the Missouri Compromise in 1820. He could have declared his freedom, but he didn't, probably because he didn't know he could do so. Then his master died. Dred Scott thought it was his master's death that would free him. He went to the courts for his freedom, making it all the way to the Supreme Court. Finally, the Supreme Court decided their ruling, making Scott a slave once more. They declared that because Scott was a black, he was not a citizen, therefore not having the right to sue. Many thought it was the most controversial decision ever by the Supreme Court. In 1896, the Supreme Court agreed to hear yet another case about race. This time it was about segregation in rail cars. A 1/8 black-skinned shoemaker by the name of Homer Plessy bought a first-class train ticket. The conductor made him sit in coach with the rest of the blacks, even though he had paid for a first-class ticket. Homer then appealed to the courts. The Supreme Court decided to hear the case after it made its way through the lower courts. They ruled segregation legal in rail cars and made Plessy pay a fine of $25. The decision would eventually be overturned in Brown versus Board of Education. When Jackie Robinson signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, he broke baseball's color barrier. He became the first colored player in the major leagues. The Cold War was beginning to form. Many newly independent nations were debating to join sides with the United States or to join with communist Russia and China. Other countries couldn't help but notice how blacks were treated as second-class citizens in the States. They worried that they might be put in that group should they join the side of the United States. In communism, people are equal despite their race or color. In the 40s, two physiologists named Kenneth and Miami Clark did some testing with dolls using black children ages 3 to 7. They showed them 4 dolls, identical except in color, and then they were asked which one they preferred the most. Surprisingly, the vast majority preferred the white doll. This test showing how segregation affected black children, they viewed the white dolls more favorably. This showed substantial evidence that segregation was truly affecting black children's views of themselves, thinking that the white race was superior. Linda Brown was a black 9-year-old girl living in Topeka, Kansas. To get to her segregated school named Monroe, Linda had to walk over a mile across dangerous railroad roads, whereas the white school is only a few blocks away, crossing normal streets. Linda's father, Oliver Brown, attempted to enroll Linda into an all-white school when she was in 3rd grade, the one close to her home. The principal refused to let her in, forcing them to go back to Monroe. The white school had more resources, better teachers, classroom facilities, and smaller class size. Monroe Elementary was turned into a National Historic Site because of the role it played on one of the most important Supreme Court cases ever. When the case finally went to court, it caught the attention of the nation. Hundreds of people lined up for the 50 tickets to watch the case in Washington, D.C., realizing the significance of the case. Thurgood Marshall was a lawyer for the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He went to Howard University, an all-black university, in 1930 and became particularly interested in civil rights law. After graduating in 1933, he joined the NAACP, following the dean, Charles Houston's advice. In 1940, he won his first Supreme Court case, Keepers versus Florida. He would then go on to win 28 more Supreme Court cases. After hearing Oliver Brown's pleas to represent his case, he readily agreed. Upon successfully winning Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, he lived somewhat of a low-profile life for a few years before being appointed judge for the Second Court of Appeals. In 1967, he became the first African American to be elevated to the most respected position in his field, a Supreme Court justice. He died in 1993. Charles Houston was the man who is known as the man that killed Jim Crow. He played a role in almost every Supreme Court case regarding segregation from 1930 to 1950. Houston was intensely passionate in his work to create equal rights for all, devoting his time, effort, and life to the NAACP. He unfortunately died in 1950 at the age of 54 and a half, without seeing the bulk of his work pay off. Right after the Supreme Court decided to hear Brown versus Board of Education, Chief Justice Fred Vinson died unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1953. Vinson was leaning heavily towards upholding segregation as constitutional. Now President Eisenhower had the heavy burden of picking the next Chief Justice. The President chose Earl Warren, known to be against segregation. Before Warren was chosen to the Supreme Court, he was a proven Republican governor from California with strong views against segregation. He knew that he had the majority in the Supreme Court, but felt that in order to make a true statement, he thought the decision needed to be unanimous. After arguing in the Supreme Court in the late months of 1954, Warren decided to wait 6 months and then decide then. During the half-a-year period, he convinced the two outcast judges to side with him because they had already lost. There were 4 cases reviewed, or merged into Brown versus the Board of Education, Briggs versus Elliott, Davis versus County School Board of Princeton Edward County, Gilbert versus Belton, and Boiling versus Sharp. Briggs versus Elliott concerned the issue of no busing for blacks, but busing for whites. Boiling versus Sharp was about an all-new white school not letting in blacks even though the school wasn't even full. Gilbert versus Belton was about poor school facilities. Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County was a case about black students going on strike for better educational facilities. Their school had an all-black student population, was old and bent out of shape, whereas the school with all white students was more spacious, had much better facilities, and better teachers. The justices for the case were Earl Warren, Hugo Black, Stanley Reed, Felix Frankfurter, William Douglas, Harold Burton, Tom Clark, and Sherman Minton. The ruling succeeded in striking down separate but equal, stopping segregation in schools. The ruling stated that school districts had to desegregate with all deliberate speed, not truly specifying how soon the schools had to desegregate. As blacks rolled into newly integrated schools, they were being harassed. One example is the Little Rock Nine, who, in 1957, were accepted into a newly integrated school, but the governor refused to let them in. The National Guard of Arkansas prevented them under the governor's orders. The president sent in the 101st Airborne Division to escort the 9 black students into their new school. The governor immediately ordered the National Guard down. This is a map of the U.S. before the ruling. After the ruling, it was all green, signifying that segregation is now forbidden everywhere. This was the first of many major wins for the civil rights movement. In some ways, Brown versus Board of Education ignited the civil rights movement. All in all, Brown versus Board of Education gave the new black generation a shot at the future with improved educational opportunities, allowing blacks to change the future for the United States. But what would have happened if Vincent had died? Would schools still be segregated? Would blacks be treated differently?